Well, I think it's the case that if a country has a balance of payments surplus, and it's, say, with the US, then it receives dollars for its goods. It gives its own currency to the American purchaser who buys the goods. This injects more currency into the economy, our own currency, and is inflationary. This is not a problem if taxes are high, because you tax more out than you are spending in your economy. And of course the dollars that you're earning, since they're acceptable all over the world, you can buy real estate or bonds or presumably equities. Any assets you like, or you can buy the raw materials and so on that the government needs for capital projects, dams and so on, and roads, whatever, and buy the necessary from foreign countries, the steel and raw materials and so on. So simply keeping your exchange rate what we might call low, so that you definitely have a big balance of payment surplus on what you're selling to the US, could be in the country's interest to do this. If you're an enemy of the US, then of course you could be spending a lot of the money on armaments and so on, and well, the whole thing could be viewed as quite a threat, couldn't it? Meanwhile, of course, the US is funding the world with enormous balances being held somewhere, unless it comes back to you as goods that you're selling for dollars, that would reduce those international balances. The dollar is more or less acting as a store of value, in as far as it is held offshore by other countries and so on. If you're funding the outflow of dollars to, especially in a country you've got a big balance of payments deficit to, if you're funding it by sale of bonds, well, it could be that the country that you've got a deficit with is using the dollars to buy bonds. If they're an enemy, I'm not sure how secure they feel such assets are, so they may unload those on the world market in favour of other assets, as listed just now. The country then builds up enormous assets, possibly around the world, possibly even in your own country, if it's allowed to buy property and businesses in the US, you see. The US, of course, could conceivably in difficult times freeze such assets, depending, how much the other country leaves itself vulnerable. And it might not. It may sell such assets to cause some sort of economic turmoil in your own country, and to hold other assets in safer places from its point of view. In some sense, then, we find that the US becomes financially vulnerable, both in being an international currency, as it's being held as an asset store, which of course people are temperamental, they could suddenly unload. And the concern of what this drain is doing as regards building up potential enemies' asset portfolio. And possibly armaments and so on as well, military strategy. This is quite apart from the fact that, as far as you've got unemployment at home, you'd rather your own resources were being used to full advantage. And you may have discontent at home, of course, rising unemployment because people are buying the cheap foreign goods. Those that still have the money to buy. What should the US do? Well, what's the goals? Does it want a zero balance of payments deficit come surplus? Or does it want some tolerable level of deficit and press for the country that's advantaging from this to change their exchange rate, to revalue, in fact, to such a level as approaches your pressed for level of deficit of trade, reduced accordingly to that. If that country is not willing to do it, you can indeed put tariffs on their goods so that they're less attractive to your population to buy, and gives you a revenue, of course, in as far as the population do still buy from such a country. And then you decide whether you're going to hold your ground and continue to raise tariffs until you reach a tolerable deficit situation with the foreigner. The foreign country who is taking advantage, so to speak, may respond by counteracting your tariffs by actually devaluing further their currency, making your tariffs of less effect, in which case you could raise the tariffs higher. Or they may respond by putting tariffs against you, in which case you respond by putting your tariffs higher. Eventually you get down to a situation where there's little or no trade between you, but the deficit is solved. At what cost? Well, your population's no longer buying the cheap goods, of course, so they're not very happy about this. It's not clear how politically acceptable this is going to be if this happens. If things turn bitter, you could freeze the foreign country's assets that are in your country, but they may be wise and have unloaded these before you get to that. But you may still have much that you could do. And the threat of such may act as a deterrent, of course, to them not meeting your requirements as regards balance of payments deficit with them. You have got other complications here, capital flows due to response to different interest rate regimes in different countries, of course. So we are looking very much at balance of trade, certainly in goods and possibly in goods and services more generally. In short, we're talking not so much about a tariff war. That's just the consequence. It's an economic war, a case of resource allocation and build-up that you find hostile to your national security and what you should do about it. You can do nothing and hope the next regime that takes over in your country sorts it out, or you can handle it head on. And you may have some electoral authority to do this because unemployment's high at home and things need to be done. There is a vulnerability to not having your own manufacturing base, and should you be pressed in times of war, you can convert such to armaments and so on, assuming you've got a conventional war. If you've got we daren't think what you've got if it's not a conventional war. If it's a nuclear one, that's, won't go into that. That's not my field. It's like everything in the world, everything is interrelated with everything else. And you can't just look at it and say this is an economic problem or this is a tariff war. No, an economic problem can be a real strategic headache from a security point of view, one country versus another. And it's very wise not to let your country be more vulnerable than you can avoid reasonably. Of course, the foreign country can't safely fight a tariff battle if the assets that it does have are in the control of, in this case, say the US. Because the US will simply freeze them. And their assets, foreigners' assets, are then worth nothing. Not to mention it relieves the US of a lot of government debt. So the foreigner would be make sure it's geared up before it does this or allows this tariff war to start. And as I say, it may well jump from a tariff war to not just a tariff, but a war. Quite simply, you have to be on your guard against potential malevolence. You know, you can get states like Nazi Germany that was definitely malevolent from Allies' point of view. And in that case, Churchill, who was an outsider and a bit of a buffoon politically, was right, and became the man for the moment when it came to war. You don't want to spend too much of your assets preparing for war, but if you don't prepare enough, of course, you stand a possibility of losing the war when it comes your way. The tariff wars of the interwar years were not of this character. They were not in a situation of where you're particularly coping with potential enemy. They were more of a response to, I think we could say, a stock market crash, 1929. Subsequent downturn in demand, goods and services across the world, and a choice of tariffs specifically to improve a country's position vis-à-vis another as regards trade, so that employment might pick up at the cost of other countries. And of course the response was to do the same back, and you ended up with no trade and a real crisis on your hands. America got out of it by basically putting up tariff wars, tariffs, so that it was just concentrating on its own internal trade, because it's almost a continental size, wasn't it? Trade within the United States would perhaps be able to be picked up, especially with the Roosevelt public projects being launched, the advantages of such spending being within the country concerned. And Europe picking up for the fear of war, of course, as concern over what was happening in Germany and so on increased. We could argue the present problem is not that the US is particularly concerned as regards the deficit with any individual country, but overall it's in massive deficit, which would indicate something's wrong with the exchange rates that's making foreign goods so attractive. If some countries are fixing their exchange rates too low, you've got to do something about it. Ban their goods, put a tariff against their goods, devalue yourself, come to some negotiation. I think that's the root of the problem here. And as I say, it's not just an economic problem. It's what's happening to these dollar balances. How are they being used by the regime, the foreigner? And does this affect national security? It most certainly does. And you need to do something about it. Thank you, Heavenly Dad. Well, in the present circumstance, of course, Trump could have simply devalued the American dollar, and that would start to impact across the whole board of exchange rates from the American point of view, improve their situation. American goods been cheaper for foreign buyers, and foreign goods being dearer for American buyers. But that politically is strategically very unpopular. Populations don't like their currency being devalued because they feel, well, immediately foreign goods cost more, that's not good news. And services too, tourism and so on, would be good for recovery from the difficulties, is not good from the politician's point of view of political survival. We have a problem here with the economic and political system, and that's hard to remedy. Worse may also result in a devaluation war instead of a tariff war. I suppose there's something here to be said for the argument that you shouldn't trade with people you do not trust. I've always felt that personally with house buying and cars. If I took to the seller and I could trust him, I was far more willing to buy and to make a transaction than if I thought they were dodgy, not going to keep their word, be trouble. I avoided them like the plague. Depends how risk averse you are, doesn't it, I suppose. Our constitutions politically are such that it favours the short run goal. You know, political careers and horizons tend to be 3 to 5 years, and economic ones probably similar. Whereas for long run, optimal decision making, well, you need structures that favour such long run decision making. We need built-in incentives in our political and economic system that encourage a more longer view of what's best to do. Thank you, Heavenly Dad.